Hero without a name.
A power failure.
They looked at each other in astonishment. Behind them, for the first time they could remember, the room was completely silent. Somewhere, in a narrow, rocky passageway in the mountain, its lifeline, an electric cable, had been cut. Deliberately, methodically, someone else had plotted to destroy the dam. Justin, of course, did not know this, nor did any of the rats perched so solemnly in the doorway of the operations center. They were certain of only one thing, their own failure. They paused and looked up the valley, the rugged cliffs, the river, the silhouette of earth and sky. They felt sadness and longing. Arthur, ever practical, broke the silence.
Look, the power's out all over the site, even in the parking lot. They'll have to use the emergency generators.
Sure enough, the long asphalt rectangle just below the road through the mountain pass was dark. But even as they stood looking, a pair of headlights appeared over the black rim of the pass. The humans were on their way to work.
Let's get out of here.
Justin's voice was like a whip cracking.
Quickly!
Inside headquarters, the others stood around in stony silence as Arthur argued with Sally.
They're safe in the cave at the top of the ridge. They went there last night. They don't expect to hear from us until we can send them a full report. And that includes an investigation of the blackout.
They should know the worst.
Sally stamped her hind foot.
You just don't want to give up. Admit that we've failed.
We're not certain that we have failed,
Arthur snapped.
I don't think they can open the dam site without electricity.
You know as well as I do that they have emergency generators.
But those are a backup system. They can only supply a limited amount of power.
Sally's teeth clenched in anger.
The rest of us want to go home, she hissed. This is a time when all of us should be together.
All I want is a few hours,
Arthur shouted.
A few hours to find out what went wrong.
Racso watched quietly. He had never seen the rats like this. Rats at home argued and hissed when they fought over a dainty morsel or a nest closer to the warmth of the steam pipes. But the rats of Thorn Valley were reasonable, cooperative, well-mannered. He turned toward Justin, but Justin was sitting alone in the corner, looking tired and dazed. Then he caught Beatrice's eye. She stepped forward and held her paws up between Arthur and Sally. She spoke softly.
We're all tired, and that makes it easier to fly off the handle. Sally, you and Arthur worked terribly hard last night, and you both did a good job. The rest of us did too. We need rest. If Arthur wants to go out and investigate while we're sleeping, let him. Perhaps he'll find that we can take advantage of the blackout. And if that's true, we must do so.
The rats nodded, except for Sally, who looked away. Arthur looked relieved. Suddenly, Timothy felt a surge of interest.
I want to go too.
Me too,
Racso said.
Sure,
Arthur said.
Come along.
From their hiding place on the cliffside, Arthur, Timothy, and Racso watched the first efforts to restore the electrical system. Within minutes, the workmen realized that the cable had broken somewhere inside the foot-wide tunnel that funneled the electric main through the mountainside. They turned their attention to the emergency generators in the basement of the operations center. When these failed to start, they grew frantic. A cry spread across the dam site. Racso strained his ears to hear. The word the men were shouting was, "Sabotage!" Timothy hurried back to the headquarters and woke the others, and soon they were stretched out on a narrow ledge above the site. The voices were hushed with excitement.
Who besides us?
Justin whispered.
Who besides us would care?
The farmers,
Timothy answered readily.
Or the man in the canoe,
Racso said.
He cared about Sea Valley. He thought it was beautiful and shouldn't be destroyed. But we would have seen them. The farmers are here,
Justin interrupted. A crowd had begun to gather for the grand opening, and beyond them, on the edge of the parking lot, a line of men and women were marching with banners. Timothy's sharp eyes could make out the biggest words, "Save our farms!" He was surprised to see Mr. and Mrs. Fitzgibbon walking side by side. Mr. Fitzgibbon was wearing a suit and looked terribly out of place. Suddenly, in the midst of all the excitement, Timothy felt homesick and longed to see his family and the cinder block house in the garden. The crowd got bigger. Out of the operations center came the chief engineer. His yellow hat was a bright dot in the late morning sunlight. The rats saw his mouth opening and closing, saw him stamp his foot on the cement. 3 men in business suits rushed up, shouting and waving their arms. "The Joneses themselves, I believe," Justin said, as if he had made the introductions personally. "And they do seem a bit upset."
"There won't be any grand opening today," Arthur said, grinning. "It'll take at least a day to fix the cable and the generators."
"Giving us another night to work on our program?" Justin smiled a big smile. "All the time we'll need, I should think." By noon, the parking lot was packed with people. They shouted and clapped. Nothing happened. At 1 o'clock, when Representative Jones stood up to make a speech, they were still clapping. He had a microphone, but because there was no electricity, it didn't work. So he looked to the rats on the ledge above him like a puppet whose mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Photographers gathered around taking his picture, but as the word spread through the crowd that there would be no grand opening, a roar of protest began. "Boo!" shouted the people. Someone threw a paper cup and hit him on the leg. Then a young boy threw a hard-boiled egg that just missed his shoulder. The police came and surrounded Representative Jones and shouted through megaphones that the crowd must go home. The rats stayed in their hiding place on the ledge until the people were gone. That afternoon they watched as workmen placed long silver ladders against the cliff and climbed up until they were only 100 feet below the spot where the rats lay. The same reporter they had seen the night before stood below the workmen and watched as they pulled the broken cable from the tunnel. As they did so, something slid out of the opening and fell to the ground below. What was it? The rats strained to see. "It's an animal," the reporter shouted. "Whatever it is, it's badly burned."
"Whatever it was, you mean?"
She didn't laugh. They saw her bending over the small dark object. She said, "It smells awful."
"It must have been in the tunnel when the cable shorted out," one of the workmen said. "It was probably looking for food and bit through the rubber insulation."
"It's the culprit, all right," the other workman added. "You can see the tooth marks here on the wire."
Jones thought it was sabotage. When both the cable and the generators went out at once, he thought the farmers did it.
The first man laughed.
"Ha ha ha ha! Whoever wrecked those generators knew what he was doing," he said. "But anyone with a brain would have known that to break the rubber on that cable was certain death."
"Of course he knew," Justin said later. "The rats were in their headquarters. They were numb."
"But who?"
Arthur asked.
"And why?"
"I don't know, but he gave us a chance to complete our mission." "He died to save the valley," Sally said quietly. Timothy frowned. "Could he have known about us?" Beatrice answered quickly, softly. "I believe he did. I believe we glimpsed him on the ramp that night. He was on his way to sabotage the generators. He hid, but he must have heard us searching." Justin nodded. "He didn't come out. He had his own plan, and he intended to carry it out."
"We must find out who he was," Arthur said. "He has a family somewhere. They must be told that he's dead and how brave he was.
They agreed to go to sleep, and they slept that night and part of the following morning. When they awoke, there was still no electricity at the site. Since they couldn't complete the mission until the cable was repaired, the rats agreed to search for clues to the identity of the stranger. They decided to look for anything: a paper, a scrap of cloth, a bit of leftover food. They searched along the ridge in each direction, looking in every bush and crack, but they found nothing. It was Timothy who realized there was somewhere else to look.
He could climb, he said suddenly. He climbed up and down the canyon wall to get to the tunnel where the cable comes through, and the cliff there is almost sheer.
There are small caves in the cliff, Justin said slowly, but it would be dangerous to search them. We have no ropes.
If we are careful, I think we can inch our way down the rock, Timothy said.
Justin shook his head.
It's too risky. I know where there's some rope,
Brendan spoke up.
Can you get it without being seen?
Brendan nodded.
I'm sure I can.
Good. We'll start as soon as you get back. Timothy and Justin went first. They descended the cliff slowly, searching the dark rock for footholds. It took them about a half hour to reach the first cave. It was empty. They climbed north along the wall toward the site. They made slow progress, for the ropes became tangled, and they had to climb up the rocks to pull them free. After a time, they stopped on a shelf of rock to rest.
It's hard to climb, Timothy said.
Justin nodded.
Some rats are more used to scaling steep walls than we are, he said. My mother grew up climbing in and out of the window of a storeroom on the 5th floor of an apartment building. She could get over a brick wall as easily as you or I can write our names.
His face grew sad. I don't even know whether she's alive now, he said. We lost touch with each other during the time I was at NIMH. I haven't been home since.
Thorn Valley's your home now, Timothy said.
Justin nodded. Or wherever the colony ends up.
Yes.
For the second time in 2 days, Timothy was homesick. Briefly, he imagined his mother gathering peanuts from the back field for their supper, Martin laughing, Cynthia and Teresa splashing each other amid the clear ripples of the brook.
We should go on, Justin said. It will soon be sunset.
His camp was in the third cave. He had left his possessions in a neat pile, as if he'd hoped they would be found. There was a dingy rag, his bed, neatly folded, and beside this, a small gray knapsack. Justin opened it. He found 2 pieces of chocolate fastened together with string. Under the string was a note. It read simply, "For O." And in the bottom of the knapsack was a scrap of newspaper. It was deeply creased, as if it had been folded and refolded many times. Timothy opened it and saw a map of Thorn Valley. Over this was the headline, "State Forest to become Lake." There was an article describing the dam and the plan to flood the valley. Someone had drawn an arrow from the map to the margin of the paper. Beside it was written a message. Timothy held the paper up to catch the last strong rays of the setting sun. He made out the words along the margin, one by one.
My son is here. He cannot swim.
It was nearly dark when Justin and Timothy got back to headquarters. They carried with them the gray knapsack. Timothy asked to be left alone with Racso, and he showed Racso what they had found. When Racso first saw the knapsack, he felt as if he were seeing a ghost. It had hung on a nail beside the sewer pipe for as long as he could remember. His mother had worn it when she went out to gather food for the family. Racso had loved to empty it for her and hang it back on the nail again. Timothy showed him the chocolate, too, and the newspaper clipping, but Racso just shook his head stubbornly.
He never went out, not after the accident. He was afraid to leave the nest. He didn't even want us to leave, because he was afraid of what might happen to us.
Timothy listened without speaking.
There's no way he could have come this far. It's all a mistake.
Racso glanced desperately at the paper, the candy, the knapsack.
Isn't it, Timothy?
His voice was pleading. Timothy didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the little packet of chocolate. He read softly. Oh, for Oscar.
No.
Racso began to cry. He pictured Jenner's face, scarred, lonely, frightened. Racso had run away, but Jenner had come after him.
I want him back,
Racso sobbed. Timothy put one paw on Racso's shoulder. Then Racso lost control of himself. The discipline and restraint he had learned at Thorn Valley slipped away, and he was a little child again. He lay down on the ground and pounded his paws against the dirt. He screamed,
I want my father!
Timothy stayed with Racso through the night. There was no need to explain what had happened. When Justin told the group about the note, Brendan and Sally realized at once that Jenner had written it. With Racso's permission, they told the others what they knew. Everyone was astonished. They were also sorry for Racso, and they did what they could to make him feel better. Brutus and Nolan made him a bed out of shredded papers, and Beatrice cooked him a little pot of mushroom tea for him. Timothy put him to bed. Racso was exhausted from crying. Within minutes, his eyelids drooped and his breathing became peaceful and still. In the morning, before Racso was awake, Justin came in and sat down beside Timothy.
Arthur and I stayed up talking last night,
he whispered.
We've decided to leave Arthur, Sally, Brutus, and Beatrice here to finish programming the computer. Arthur thinks it can be done tonight. The rest of us will go home. There'll be a lot of people on the site today. It'll be safer to have most of us gone.
Justin paused, and then he sighed wearily.
Jeremy is due in this morning, he continued. He'll be flying back to Mr. Fitzgibbon's farm after he makes his delivery. I'm going to ask him to take you with him. You must tell Mrs. Frisbee and the others what has happened and what we expect to happen. We'll send a message as soon as the job is done.
Timothy nodded. He knew that he should volunteer to stay on to help Arthur and the others, but at the same time he felt tired, more tired than he had ever been in his whole life. More than anything, he wanted to go to sleep in his own bed, to wake up to the rippling brook and the faraway hum of Mr. Fitzgibbon's tractor as it turned the soil for the planting of the summer crops. Justin seemed to know what he was thinking.
It's been a hard year for you.
Exciting, too.
Timothy looked at Racso, curled up on the bed. It seemed as if they had known each other forever. Their friendship was a fact now, as solid as the heavy walnuts that dropped from the branches of the gnarled tree beside the creek each September, as reliable as the thawing of frozen fields in spring. Justin followed Timothy's gaze.
We'll take good care of him.
I know. It's just that I'm not sure I should leave so soon.
Justin was firm.
Jenner left him with us. He trusted us to raise him. We can help him through this, and he'll be here in the fall, when you come back to school.
Justin paused.
Your family is waiting to see you.
Timothy closed his eyes and smiled. He imagined a celebration of his homecoming, a special dinner of fresh peas and cauliflower and mushrooms. He imagined getting the message that the dam was destroyed and the plans for the lake abandoned. It was hard to open his eyes again, to see the bleak walls of the headquarters and Justin's lined face.
Yes,
he said slowly.
I'm ready to go home.
In Memoriam. The newspaper told the story, adding headline after headline until it seemed that the whole world had nothing to talk about except the scandal of the Trout River Dam. The rats posted the articles along the wall of the meeting room. Blackout blocks opening of Trout River Dam. Gate malfunction damages TR Dam. More trouble at Thorn Valley. Dynamite destroys computer. State nixes funds in Jones scandal. Jones, it was sabotage. There was another article, too, clipped from the back pages of the Smithville Tribune. Its headline was, Rumor Ties Rats to Dam Problems, and it was written by Lindsay Scott. The story included interviews with two night watchmen who claimed to have met an intelligent rat in the Computer Operations Center one night and who had subsequently been fired, and with a workman who had reason to believe that a rat had actually severed the electric cable that powered the dam. A third source claimed to have seen the black, oily tracks of a small mammal outside the entrance to the emergency generator system. Although Representative Jones refused to make any specific charges concerning the rats, he was quoted as saying that the farmers would stop at nothing to close the dam. A spokesman for the farmers said simply, We thank God for what happened, and if there were others involved, we thank them too. Most of the rats found the article amusing, but Justin felt uneasy about it. He wondered what Lindsay Scott had thought as she interviewed the workmen. The article didn't suggest that they were crazy or even drunk. Would she guess that there were rats who lived in Thorn Valley and wanted to preserve it? Would she remember the place along the creek where she had found the little basket and try to return there? Would she begin to wonder how rats could become so smart that they could read and write or even program a computer? Would she talk to scientists? He shuddered. Perhaps his imagination was running away with him. He wanted to think so, but he couldn't be sure. Most of the rats concluded that their problems with the dam were over. They celebrated by spending long afternoons swimming and splashing in Emerald Pond or lying on the banks eating juicy wild strawberries. Their relief turned to laughter. The younger rats built a diving platform out of stones and bamboo and performed acrobatic feats as they leaped from it into the cool water. Under the cautious coaching of Christopher and Brendan, Racso learned to swim. He was extremely proud of himself as he paddled from one edge of the pond to the other, and he was apt to flick his tail across the surface of the water to splash Isabella, who responded with indignant squeals. Her attitude toward Racso had changed. As a member of the successful sabotage unit, he was admired by everyone, and it had been his father, Jenner, who had given his life to stop the dam. Not only that, but Justin had announced his intention of getting married to someone else. There had been a whole week when Isabella felt like growling each time she heard the name Beatrice. She told Justin how she felt, and he was gentle and kind, but he didn't say anything about changing his plans. Finally, Isabella just gave up. If Justin didn't appreciate her, maybe somewhere there was a rat who did. She remembered how Racso had let her take credit for saving Christopher. Maybe being short wasn't so bad after all. The next time Isabella saw Racso, she took off her dirty apron and twirled her whiskers around one paw to make them curl. The following day, she made up a big batch of peppermint candy and left it outside the door to his bedroom. Racso ate it all at one sitting. He got sick, and Isabella brought him soup and wiped his forehead with a wet rag. It was Beatrice who suggested that a special stone be erected in honor of Jenner, who had helped save Thorn Valley. She talked with Hermione, Justin, and Nicodemus, and they agreed to hold a memorial service for him in the fall after the stone was carved and set in place. When another letter arrived in the Fitzgibbons' south field, dropped by courier crow among the cabbages and black-eyed peas. The animals who found it guessed at once whom it was for. They had all heard about Timothy's role in saving their homes. They also knew of Mrs. Frisby's bravery in flying all the way to Thorn Valley to warn the rats about the dam. Although they could not read the neatly lettered envelope, they hurried together, a chipmunk, 2 moles, and the shrew, to the Frisbys' summer house beside the brook. "It's for you," they chorused when Mrs. Frisby appeared in the doorway. "A crow dropped it just 10 minutes ago. We saw it fall and brought it right away." "Open it at once," the shrew commanded, as if the letter were her own. But Mrs. Frisby was flustered. She could not help but remember the first letter which had brought the news about Timothy. These past months had been so wonderful, with her family all together and the threat of the dam gone, that she really did not want to open the letter. What if it held bad news? Then she saw it was addressed not just to her, but also to Timothy. She called him from the bedroom, where he had been busy polishing his rock collection. "What is it, Mother?" You got a letter, and we found it in..." "We got a letter, and we found it in the garden. We got a letter, and we found it in the garden. We saw the crow drop it, and we knew it was for you, so we brought it right away," the shrew interrupted in a bossy voice. "It's from the rats, I'm sure." She smiled at Timothy, and her voice grew softer. Like all the other animals on the farm, she regarded him as a hero. "Open it, Timothy." Timothy carefully slit the birch bark envelope and pulled out a sheet of paper. The borders were decorated with pokeberry ink, and in the center of the page there was a printed invitation, which Timothy read out loud. "A memorial service for Jenner will be held at Thorn Valley, September 10th at 10 a.m. Under the invitation was a note in wobbly handwriting. "I hope you can come. We have invited Jeremy too. Love, Racso." Timothy looked eagerly at his mother. "Can I go? Can I go, Mother?" Mrs. Frisby hesitated, but only for a moment. "You will need to get to school anyway," she said, "and I would certainly rather have you fly than walk by yourself." "But what about you, Mrs. Frisby?" the shrew asked. "You are invited too." Mrs. Frisby smiled. "But I am needed here at home with Cynthia and Teresa, and anyway, I don't really deserve to be there. My part in this adventure was a small one." "I will watch Cynthia and Teresa," the shrew announced, "because you must go. You flew there before to tell them about the dam. That was an act of courage, and now you must fly there to thank them for all of us." Mrs. Frisby looked at the shrew with some surprise. It was not like her to offer expressions of gratitude. The chipmunk and the moles, usually shy and retiring, nodded their heads in agreement and looked intently at Mrs. Frisby. "Well," she said, half to herself, "I hadn't thought of it that way." "Do come, Mother," Timothy said. "Your last visit was so short, you didn't even get to see our playground." Mrs. Frisby smiled. It would be nice to visit Thorn Valley without feeling worried, to relax and talk with her friends Justin and Nicodemus. "Well," she said softly, "perhaps I will." There were no strangers among the group that gathered in the pine grove on that special September day. Racso was delighted to see Timothy, who would be staying at Thorn Valley to go to school. They reminded each other that it had been almost exactly a year since the day they had met. They laughed about the autumn afternoon when Timothy had tasted candy for the first time, and Racso had met a field mouse who could read. The stone itself was beautiful, a white quartz about 5 inches tall. The rats had engraved it with the name Jinner in a flowing script, and beneath this, at Racso's request, the word hero. The stone was set into the cool green moss along the bank of the brook, close to the memorial marked R. The ceremony consisted of 2 speeches, with a break in between for refreshments. Beatrice gave the first speech. She talked about a moonlit night in a place where most of the rats had never been. She talked about a shadow so quick and faint that she and Nolan had to reassure themselves they had seen it at all.
We were the last ones to see him alive, she said. We didn't even see his face. If we had, I don't think we would have believed it, because to most of us, Jenner was already dead. But we had forgotten that Jenner was a rebel. The accident in the hardware store killed 6 others, but it didn't kill him. With incredible willpower, he saved himself.
Beatrice paused.
We can only guess what it must have been like for him to leave the nest again after 3 years. But we can guess this, that he feared more for Racso than he did for himself. He developed a plan to stop the dam, and that plan became his world. That night on the ramp, we called out to him, but he didn't answer. He may not have known who we were, or that Racso was with us. Or he may have known and feared that we would destroy his plan. He may have guessed that we would fail, but was certain that he would not. The terrible days of the mission are ended and are like a dream for us now,
Beatrice said.
but the deeds of Jenner will live on. He has taken his place in our history and among our heroes.
Beatrice walked over and stood beside the monument. She touched it with one palm. She looked into the faces of the rats in front of her.
To you, Jenner, father of Racso, I dedicate this stone,
she said.
Though time will pass, you will never be forgotten.
There was a moment of silence. Tears streamed from Racso's eyes, and he made no motion to wipe them away. Other rats cried too. Still others sat quietly, thinking of the adventures that had befallen them since their escape from the laboratory years ago. Mrs. Frisbee thought of her husband Jonathan, who had given his life trying to secure the future of the colony. She felt shy but proud. She knew that Timothy had returned to the farm from the sabotage mission tired but different. There was a self-confidence about him that she had never seen before. Watching him sitting in the moss between Racso and Isabella, she realized that he had grown up. But it was only an instant later that Timothy snatched Racso's hat. He waved it once and headed straight for the brook.
Hey, give that back.
Racso grinned and shook his paw.
That's my hat.
Come and get it.
I'll get it. Don't you worry.
No.
I'll get it. Don't you worry, Racso.
Christopher raced for the water. He looked lithe and strong. It was hard for Mrs. Frisbee to imagine that he had been so sick only months before. Elvira had done her job well. Although there had been help from others, of course. Christopher did a swan dive off the bank and swam after Timothy, who had the hat between his teeth.
You'd better give that back.
Isabella stood on her hind legs on the bank, squealing.
Racso needs that.
Does he now?
Brendan gave a hard push, and Isabella was wet up to her neck. He jumped in behind her.
Racso, I adore you, he cooed. You mad hatter of a scientist, you loving laboratory worker, you peppermint king.
You'll be sorry, Brendan.
But when Isabella saw that even Racso was laughing, she laughed too. Timothy threw her the hat, and she put it on. She looked at her reflection in the water, shook her head, and threw the hat back to Racso, who plopped it, sopping, on his own head. The young rats played in the brook until the refreshments were served, nutcakes and wild grape juice. The older rats chatted. Those who were strangers introduced themselves to Mrs. Frisbee. She met Elvira, the doctor, and Bertha, the gardener. She met Hermione and Nolan and Beatrice. She talked with Justin and Arthur, who had helped to move her house years before. Mrs. Frisbee was a bit startled to see that the fur around Nicodemus's nose had turned white. He was growing old. She remembered that the rats had thought that shots they had received in the laboratory at NIMH would keep them young forever. So they had been wrong. She sighed. She did not like to think of a world without Nicodemus in it. But a cheerful voice interrupted her mood. "Turn around, everyone. Look at Jeremy." Mrs. Frisbee scurried around the larger rats just in time to see Justin fasten a medal around Jeremy's neck. The medal was round with a large glittery J in the middle. For your part in the sabotage mission, we wish to honor and thank you with this medal, Justin said. It was made especially for you by Racso and Christopher. It's shiny. It's made from chips of mica, Racso explained. We glued it on by ourselves. Thank you. In his delight, Jeremy hopped from one foot to the other. He flapped his wings. I'm going to fly home and show it to my friends. Don't leave without Mrs. Frisbee, Nicodemus said. She's counting on you for a ride. I forgot all about her. Jeremy hung his head, but a second later, Sally appeared with a basket of wild figs. Aren't these your favorites? We saved them for you. Jeremy's eyes gleamed. He swallowed the figs whole, one after another. Nicodemus made the closing speech. He talked about the bonds between rats, the web of parents and grandparents and great-grandparents going so far back in time that some claimed that all rats were descended from just one family. He talked about Jenner's love for Racso, which had caused him to give up his own life to save his son. For some, love is the strongest force there is, Nicodemus said. Rats like these, Martha and Red and Jenner, are the most likely to risk their lives for others and to become heroes. In doing so, they show a greatness of spirit that is wonderful and moving to think of. I myself have never been like that, Nicodemus said, somewhat sadly. My mind has been more inclined to the practical, to the tasks at hand, the planting of seeds, the teaching of our children, the building of our home. And my goals for the colony have been practical ones: cooperation, efficiency, organization. Yet these alone were not enough to stop the dam. Nicodemus paused. He looked directly at Racso. You told me once that you dreamed of becoming a hero, he said. I remember I told you that we did not breed heroes here, and that everyone must do his part in making the community strong. Nicodemus smiled. I still believe that, he said. But if young rats should find their minds wandering sometimes to heroic feats, or if they dream of triumphs and victories we have not yet undertaken to win, I wish them well. And if I should see them here in the pine grove, sitting alone beside these monuments, I will bide my time before I send them back to work or school. Evening fell on Thorn Valley. The sun, a glowing ball against the dark stone of the mountain, cast a reddish light over the brambles and woodlands. Most of the rats had already gone indoors when Mrs. Frisbee kissed Timothy goodbye and climbed up Jeremy's wing to sit behind his head. They rose in the sky and circled once. Usually, Mrs. Frisbee kept her eyes shut tight while she was flying, but for some reason she opened them as they completed the wide circle. She looked down. Far beneath them, she could see the dark shapes of Timothy and three rats sitting together beside the brook. Their heads were close together, as if they were deep in conversation. Although she could not identify the rats, she could see that one was shorter than the rest. Then Timothy looked up and saw Jeremy. By now, he was so high up that his body was only a black spot against the broad expanse of the evening sky. Although he was sure that the crow couldn't see him, he raised his paw and waved it once, twice, 3 times. Jeremy seemed to hover in one spot, and for an instant Timothy imagined that he could see his mother on the crow's back, looking down at him. Then the bird flew higher, and within a minute they were gone. The end.